On just 2 frantic days in April 1975, more than 7,000 people were airlifted out of Saigon by helicopter, while tens of thousands more crowded the streets, desperate for a way out. It was the chaotic end of a decades-long conflict, the moment the Vietnam War truly ended, and the world watched the Fall of Saigon live on TV. Join me as I dive deep into the events of the Fall of Saigon and try to piece together what really happened on the streets, in the embassies, and in the minds of the people who lived through it. The Fall of Saigon wasn't just the capture of a city. It marked the end of the Vietnam War, the collapse of the US-backed South Vietnamese government, and the victory of North Vietnam and its allies. It reshaped Southeast Asia, damaged American confidence, and became a powerful symbol, depending on where you stand, of liberation, abandonment, or defeat. To understand those last 48 hours in Saigon, we need to rewind and see how a superpower and its ally ended up in a situation where helicopters on rooftops were their last option. Vietnam's modern conflict began long before American helicopters. After World War II, Vietnamese nationalists led by Ho Chi Minh fought French colonial rule, winning a decisive victory at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The 1954 Geneva Accords temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with a communist-led North and a US-backed South, supposedly until nationwide elections could be held. Those elections never happened. Instead, the US increased support for the South, seeing Vietnam as a key battleground in the Cold War struggle against communism. Over the 1960s, American involvement escalated, from advisors to bombing campaigns to hundreds of thousands of US ground troops fighting a grinding war against communist forces in the South, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army. By the early 1970s, after years of heavy casualties, protests at home, and political pressure, the US was looking for a way out without simply abandoning Saigon. The answer, at least on paper, was Vietnamization, training and equipping the South Vietnamese army to take over the fighting, while American troops gradually withdrew. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. US combat forces left Vietnam, American POWs came home, and Washington hoped that a now independent South Vietnam could hold the line with continued US money and weapons, but no more troops. On paper, South Vietnam still looked strong, a large army, a capital city bursting with life, and continued US financial aid. But underneath, there were serious problems. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, was big but had uneven training, corruption in the officer corps, and a heavy dependence on US air support and logistics. The South Vietnamese government in Saigon, led by President Nguyen Van Thu, struggled with internal divisions, corruption, and declining public trust. Economically, the end of massive US spending inside South Vietnam hit hard. Inflation rose, unemployment increased, and many people felt that the wartime US boom had vanished. Meanwhile, North Vietnam saw the US withdrawal as proof that time was on its side. Its leaders believed that with patience and pressure, the South would eventually collapse. Throughout 1973 and 1974, both sides violated the ceasefire. There were clashes, artillery duels, and strategic moves, but no full-scale offensive yet. Then, in 1974, a new factor hit South Vietnam. US aid was sharply reduced. As the Watergate scandal consumed Washington and the US Congress grew wary, Saigon's lifeline began to shrink. In early 1975, North Vietnam decided it was time to test the South's strength. They launched an offensive in the Central Highlands, targeting the city of Ban Ma Thuot. Ban Ma Thuot fell faster than expected. The ARVN was caught off guard, and when they tried to counterattack, they failed. For North Vietnam's leaders, this was a signal. The South was weaker than they had hoped. In a controversial move, President Nguyen Van Thu ordered a strategic withdrawal from large parts of the Central Highlands and northern provinces to shorten his defensive lines and concentrate forces. But on the ground, this pullback turned into a disaster. Poor planning, bad roads, panicked civilians, and continued attacks turned the retreat into a disaster, especially on Route 7B, where desperate soldiers and civilians were attacked while fleeing. One by one, northern cities like Hue and Da Nang collapsed in quick succession, with hundreds of thousands of refugees streaming south toward Saigon. Morale in the ARVN plummeted. Many soldiers felt abandoned, confused by sudden orders to abandon territory they had defended for years. By late March and early April 1975, North Vietnamese forces were rolling south with surprising speed. What they had expected might take years was now taking weeks. In Washington, U.S. officials realized that South Vietnam was collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. Requests for renewed large-scale aid went to Congress, but there was little appetite to re-enter the war. By April 1975, Saigon was surrounded by advancing North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. Inside the city, the mood shifted from anxious to desperate. The U.S. had reduced its presence to a small embassy staff and a handful of military advisors. But tens of thousands of South Vietnamese who had worked with the Americans feared they would be targeted as traitors if the North took over. Rumors spread quickly that assassination lists existed, that re-education camps would imprison former officials and officers, that anyone associated with the old regime could be in danger. President Tu, under immense pressure and blamed by many for recent defeats, resigned on April 21st and left the country, further shaking what remained of public confidence. His successors tried to negotiate a ceasefire or a coalition government, but North Vietnam's leaders, sensing imminent victory, demanded unconditional surrender. Meanwhile, the U.S. ambassador in Saigon, Graham Martin, was hesitant to order a full evacuation at first, partly out of hope for a negotiated exit, and partly fearing that visible panic would cause the government and army to collapse even faster. But as enemy artillery began to hit near Saigon's airport at Tan Son Nhat, it became clear that a normal, orderly evacuation by plane was no longer possible. In late April, the U.S. activated its emergency plan with a dramatic code phrase broadcast on the radio. The temperature in Saigon is 105 degrees and rising. The signal to start Operation Frequent Wind. Operation Frequent Wind was the largest helicopter evacuation in history, using Marine Corps and Air Force helicopters to lift Americans and at-risk South Vietnamese from Saigon to U.S. Navy ships offshore. As the operation began on April 29th, thousands of people crowded around the U.S. Embassy and other pickup points, waving documents, photos, anything that might prove a connection to the Americans. Marines formed defensive lines and tried to maintain order while evacuation lists were checked and rechecked. Not everyone with a claim could get in. Some were turned away, leading to heart-wrenching scenes at the gates. On the rooftops of buildings, including the famous CIA apartment building often mistaken for the U.S. Embassy, helicopters landed one after another, loading as many people as they safely could. The U.S. Navy, seeing overloaded South Vietnamese helicopters landing on their decks, sometimes had to push those choppers overboard after unloading passengers to make room for more. In the streets below, many South Vietnamese who couldn't reach evacuation points looked for other options: boats on the river, small planes at secondary airfields, or simply hiding and hoping. Throughout the night of April 29th into the morning of April 30th, helicopters kept flying. The last U.S. Marines fought back any attempts to breach the embassy walls as they gradually shrank the perimeter and evacuated rooftop by rooftop. At around dawn on April 30th, the final group of Marines at the embassy received their order: time to go. They destroyed equipment, lowered the flag, and boarded the last helicopter off the roof. Just hours later, North Vietnamese tanks entered Saigon. One famous image shows a tank crashing through the gates of the Presidential Palace, now the Reunification Palace, marking the official end of the Republic of Vietnam. On radio, a South Vietnamese officer announced surrender and told all units to lay down their arms. For some, this meant relief that the fighting was over. For others, especially officials and soldiers, it was the start of a frightening unknown. In the days and months that followed,
Many former South Vietnamese officers, officials, and intellectuals were sent to re-education camps, some for months, others for many years. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese fled the country over the coming years, often by sea, becoming known as the boat people, facing storms, pirates, and uncertain reception abroad. For the United States, the Fall of Saigon burned images into the national memory of helicopters on rooftops, allies left behind, and a war that ended not with victory, but evacuation. So what really happened in the Fall of Saigon? A rapid military collapse, political miscalculation, and an emergency airlift that could save some, but never everyone. It was the end of one chapter for Vietnam and the beginning of another. Reunification under Hanoi's rule, long economic hardship,